This is House Planning Help episode 37. Hey, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and if you're looking to build or retrofit a house, this is the podcast for you. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century, my goal being to create an energy efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up in this session, how to avoid the pitfalls of self-build. My guest is Jason Orme, who is the editor of Homebuilding and Renovating magazine, and we're going to delve into that. So it's great that you're here again. Thank you very much for downloading. This is always a pleasure to be doing this, but particularly if you're someone new. And I have a great example that I wanted to launch straight into. Someone who's new, but someone who is, well, I'll read this. Hello to the Wilson. He says on his iTunes review, I'm a recent Part 1 architectural graduate with a keen interest in one day designing and building my very own low energy home. I only discovered these podcasts last week and have already listened to every single one. I really hope the presenter continues to produce these long after he completes his own home. Great stuff. Wow. Very kind words. Thank you very much to the Wilson. And I always find it exciting that I can offer some value. I know it's obviously the guests that I interview and they are very knowledgeable people, so I can try to keep them coming. Keep them coming is the best way forward. But this is the penultimate episode of 2013. And it got me thinking to what I hope to do next year, both on a personal level and also with my production company. We create lots of content for online, but it would be great. I have lots of ideas of content that we could be putting together, but it's always a matter of funding. So I thought I would mention this, that if you are someone who works in the environmental space, or perhaps you run a business and you would normally spend money on advertising or marketing, and you're at that stage where you're thinking, what should we do next year? How are we going to go about things? Why not use that money instead and invest it in content? It's the way things are going anyway, but what it means is not only can you help someone provide value online, but you'll also find that it keeps working for you. And I think the Wilson is a perfect example of this, that he only found the podcast series a week or so back and he's already got stuck in and listened to the whole lot. And that's content that I started off recording just over a year ago. So he's gone through all of that and listened to it, and I really appreciate that too. But that just goes to show how you could perhaps be helping this bigger cause as well. And if I can be the person to help you on your way, and if you want to work with my production company Regen Media, then what I'll do is I'll put a link in the show notes. This will forward you on to some more details. So if you go to houseplanninghelp.com/content, and it will tell you more. But I do see people making quite a few mistakes when they produce their videos, and often you think no one will sit through and watch this. Why have you created a 10 or 15 minute video that actually, who is this aimed at? And it's just a bit wishy-washy. So the great thing about the internet is you can just get so targeted. You really can. And as I say, I have all sorts of things that I hope I can get producing next year, either under my own steam, or if you want to work with me, then that's a possibility. So houseplanninghelp.com/content. It's time for our featured interview, and Homebuilding and Renovating is the leading self-build publication in the UK. Perhaps if you live in the UK, you're listening to this podcast, you might already be a subscriber, but their website has a ton of information if you're listening overseas. And when I launched House Planning Help, they've been really supportive actually of what I've been doing. I have a mini blog on there, and every couple of weeks I write a short piece for their community. But we've also spoken to a couple of their experts in the past, people like Mark Brinkley and Roger Hunt. So this interview with the editor Jason Orme is definitely overdue. We've had it in the pipeline for a while, but you know that I like to, where possible, sit down and have a face-to-face interview rather than over Skype. So that's exactly what we came to doing. And it just worked out that a couple of weeks ago we sorted it out. So this is the interview from that. We talk about a few areas: self-build, custom build, and also how things are moving in the UK. But the main focus of this is on some of the challenges that you will need to overcome. I started by asking Jason how he got into self-build.
Well, I applied for a job. I was a young kind of wannabe journalist and applied for a job on a magazine I'd never heard of called Homebuilding and Renovating. It was local to me in Birmingham, and I met the editor then, Michael Holmes. Really enjoyed hanging out with him. He was wise enough to give me a job, and it started from there. I'd had a bit of a background in surveying, but nothing special really. And I came at it gradually, spent 6 months or a year immersing myself in what to a 23-year-old kid was a very confusing world of ventilation and air tightness and all these very complex and slightly less glamorous things than I'd hoped. But actually I grew to sort of meet self-builders, and I grew to find that actually creating an individual house, either through renovation or self-build, was a really interesting and fun thing to do. And it was just about the same time that Grand Designs was starting up as well. And I sensed that there was something happening that was interesting to be a part of. And I grew to be really interested in architecture and house design in particular. And I grew to be interested in the process of building houses and all the stuff that you could put in them. So my interest really developed after starting to work on a magazine, but really began to take over my life really in the early 2000s. And obviously I bought a plot in 2004, the same year I got married. And really since then I've been a little bit obsessed by it, really.
What would you say are some of the key changes then that have happened in self-build in the time that you have been editor at the magazine?
Well, the people we meet have changed so significantly, really, that I think that's probably the biggest change I've seen. Certainly from the late 90s and the early 2000s, it really was people like me back then. It was young people, not necessarily with lots of money, who were keen to create an individual house and weren't able to throw hundreds of thousands of pounds at it. Grand Designs had just started back then, so it was 1999, I think, Grand Design's first show. So there was a nascent kind of movement growing, and there was a kind of very small movement back then. Grand Designs really began to take off, and my sense was that really it changed around the kind of the 2007, 2008 crash era. We found really that the audience changed almost overnight. It went from, young ordinary families to mainly kind of retired types who had cash. The big problem obviously at the moment is people having access to mortgages and finance, and almost overnight those mortgages disappeared back in 2008. So the people with cash were the ones who had recently retired, and they were the ones who we were talking to.
And what would you say then, how are we going to address this if money is the issue?
Well, there's a part of it that will naturally change, I think. As the economy kind of improves, I think those mortgages will begin to come back on stream. So I think to an extent, part of it will take care of itself. The biggest problem, I think, by a long way is availability of plots and therefore price of plots. And the two are very closely linked. It's not difficult to find a plot if you've got £1 million, But my sense really is that government initiatives to change planning policy, to change red tape around self-build will help significantly to make it easier for people. And their aim is to really double the number of people building their own homes within, I think, 5 or 10 years, which doesn't sound that ambitious, considering that I think there's 11,300 homes built last year. But we all know it can get to kind of 20, 30,000 at least, if not much more than that. So there are things that are beginning to happen, but it's a very slow revolution.
What do you find are the common pitfalls that people fall into? You must have seen a lot of projects in your time, so maybe we could go over some of those and hopefully we can avoid it.
Well, look, the first, I'm sort of setting myself up for a fall really here, but I think the first one to kind of, that I've learned really is that if projects are going to go wrong, they're usually going wrong from day one. And the reason I say that is that people often go over budget, and that's the biggest problem that people face naturally. And they're going over budget because the design of the house doesn't meet their estimated or wanted build cost. And the reason for that is because a lot of great architects around, but not actually a lot of great architects know that much about building costs. And that sounds quite controversial, but actually it's true in my experience. Architects are great at designing wonderful houses. They're not that great, in my opinion, at marrying up the budget to the design. So I often see people come to me with plans for a massive house that looks very complicated, and there's lots of kit in it, and there's very complicated roof shapes and all that stuff. And they've got a budget that is completely unrealistic. And many of them go ahead and do that, and they're on a road to ruin, really, in my opinion.
How do you know, though? Because you have no idea of the history. I suppose you could check with other clients, couldn't you, to see if they had ended up paying a lot more? Because in my experience, too, what I've heard people say, sometimes it even is to the architect's advantage if you go over budget.
It absolutely is. Most of them get paid on a percentage of build costs, so it's definitely in their interest to increase that build cost. But my sense really is that definitely approach previous clients is probably a good starting point. And one really good tip, I think, is to try and run most things through a QS, a quantity surveyor. They're independent experts who will be able to effectively do a full materials and labour schedule of your build taken off from the plans that the architect has given you. So they will give you an independent assessment of the costs before you've started. And at that stage, you can then go back to the architect and say, look, it's £100,000 over budget. I mean, I met somebody recently who went something like £1 million over budget on a £1.8 million build. I mean, that's significant, and that's, crippling, really. It happens at all budgets. I mean, £200,000 houses can go 10 or 20% over. There's some things that you're never going to be able to budget for and account for, usually things that you don't know about, i.e. foundations. But the design stuff, the above ground stuff should all be absolutely manageable and quantifiable. And in all too many instances, I think people take on projects, big projects, and this is a life-changing project, don't forget, without really doing enough research in terms of how it's going to come in at the end 9 months down the line.
One of the most profound things that I think I've learnt is about scale and how scale can really set you off in all directions. Do you think people just have a tendency to go too big, or is that almost the market that we've got, these retired people who've got pots of money, they really can just fulfill their dreams?
Well, look, I mean, I think, let's set it out on the basis that self-built homes, almost by design, are bigger than houses that you would buy on the open market. The average self-built home, I think we cover in a magazine, is something just a little over 200 square metres. The average new estate house is something like 80 or 90, I think. So they're already twice the size of the average house. But actually, most people can have a very comfortable existence in a 4-bedroom home of around 200 square metres, which is big, but it's not massive. Yet I also meet people who build, well, the biggest one I've seen is 2,000 square metres, I think. So, I mean, homes are big, and people to an extent are building because they want a big home, I think. They want a comfortable home for their family to grow up in. David Snell, who continues to write for the magazine, always says that one of the great reasons for the breakdown in society is because houses are too small. So growing families, particularly when you've got teenage kids, they need their own space, and it's preferential if they're in their own big bedroom with a bit of a guest suite rather than on the streets. And my view is the same, is that I think homes should grow with families and be flexible enough to do that. But absolutely, I mean, the number one rule of managing build costs is build small. And I know you've met Sarah Suzanka, who we've had sort of writing for the magazine in the past, and I'm a massive advocate of her approach, because she shows actually that small homes needn't necessarily feel small. There's a design nuance there that you can achieve, and I think that's something that I'm interested in very much.
It's interesting looking at this market then, that it's a lot of older people who have that wealth. Are there any changes that you see that we could make to somehow kickstart it for the younger people? For example, I'm a homeowner, I've paid off a lot of my mortgage, so theoretically I should be able to get exactly the same doing a self-build, maybe.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that the audience that you're describing, yourself and me to an extent, we're the right side of 40 just about, and, with a young family and all that stuff. And we really should be able to build our own home in the way that if we were living in Australia or the States or the Netherlands or anywhere else, pretty much, you could do. And I think the government is working very hard, and we've been a part of those discussions really to try and release land and to try and introduce this kind of what is a new concept, but actually is a pretty old concept as well, of custom build, which is to an extent a subsector of self-build. It's still people creating individual homes that they specify from the start, but it's just de-risking the whole process. So the things we talked about at the start of this discussion, going over budget, all the common mistakes that people make, the idea is that they want to really de-risk that by having fixed priced build costs, releasing lots of land. There might not be massive plots, but they're fully serviced and perfectly respectable plots in locations that you want to live. So that you'll get an individual home. You won't have to go through the process of getting planning permission and all the difficulties that might entail for the individual self-builder, and you won't have to deal with individual builders, all those problems that you might get as well there. So to an extent, it's happening, and some of those custom build sites are coming on stream. The biggest one, of course, is the one at Graven Hill. In near Bicester in Oxfordshire, which is going to be apparently 1,000 or so individual self-build plots, all of which are going to be through custom build schemes effectively. So it's happening, it's going to be a slow revolution. And, we had a phone call into the office last week of somebody who was pretty upset about the fact that all these government schemes that we'd been profiling in a magazine over the past couple of years hadn't really helped him at all. He was looking for a plot, and what on earth was going on? He was desperate to build his own house. But we had to tell him really that it's not going to happen overnight. And the truth is, it might be a generation really before those things kick in.
It's funny, as you were describing that situation, I suddenly thought to myself, I don't know that many people who've gone down this route. So another thing, it being unfamiliar, I probably know a lot more people who've just bought a brand new volume-built house than I do who have gone down the self-build route. So how do we make that progression?
Well, absolutely, it's a cultural issue, really. I mean, and cultural issues do not change overnight, and it's going to be a generation, I think, before our children grow up with the idea that it's a realistic opportunity for them, and you don't have to be a rich person to do it, and you don't have to go through the heartache that you might have seen on Grand Designs. There's been a lot of research, really, about how many people want to build their own house in the UK, and I've heard figures of 6 million, 1 in 3, all these kind of things, But actually, when you begin to drill it down into, okay, well, now you've got to go and find a plot. How are you going to do that? All of a sudden those figures drop off significantly to the current situation of where we are with 11,300 self-builds a year. So until those people see it as a realistic option for them, which is not going to be overnight, and it's not going to be next year, it's going to be in 10 years probably, then you're not going to have that massive demand. And, ultimately that's what it needs. It needs significant demand that is easily achievable.
Do you think that self-builders are intrinsically different? They must be very motivated people. All the people that I have met, I've just been impressed with. You can tell they're going to do it because they've got the right attitude. And I worry that, as you say, this cultural difference, I don't think we have enough people who've got that determination, that drive, that willingness to learn.
Yeah, I mean, there are many drivers for people to build their own house, I think, and there's many different reasons why people do it. And I think what's interesting really is that the one thing that tends to tie them all together is a little bit of an entrepreneurial spirit. Now, we meet. I mean, obviously, I've met hundreds, if not thousands, of self-builders over the years, and there's no common theme. People from all walks of life and all jobs do it, but I meet an awful lot of people who've got their own business, who are that kind of independent type, and people who are generally dissatisfied with being given something that they believe is not really for them. So there's a driver to that of sort of independence and individuality, which I think holds them together as a type of person, regardless of the job they're in, actually. So there's that kind of spirit, and I think ultimately what needs to happen is that needs to almost be dissolved in a way, and that custom build really is all about making it attractive and achievable for everybody, whether they're the most cautious, timid person that you could possibly imagine, or whether they are that independent entrepreneur.
It's one thing saying custom build, but where are we going to be getting this from? Are we looking at places like Germany where they're very successful and just bringing it over, or do you think that, because you almost take a bit of a risk going down this route, don't you, because you need factories. I know that Arche House have set up or are in the process of setting up a factory, and that's quite exciting, but it's a big risk for them as well. A
huge risk, and I think ultimately I know the government's been spending an awful lot of time looking at developments and housing cultures across the world, and I've got relatively good experience of the States and also Australia, and my sense is that they've looked at that, and particularly in Australia, in my experience, there's all different types of self-build exist. So there is the custom build development, there is the kind of design and build package on individual plots, which in a way mirrors our existing self-build culture. But the numbers are just so significantly different. In Australia, it's something like, I think, somewhere between 50 and 100,000 homes delivered this way, and the population of a third of the UK. So there are significant changes that need to happen, but, basing it on an existing housing culture is certainly the way to go. And obviously, there's been an awful lot of talk about Almere in the press and certainly around the industry recently. And that's a pretty good example of how it might work over here on a larger scale. Although Almere is far from perfect. I mean, it's far from finished, and there are a lot of interesting individual houses. There's a lot of demand for them, I understand. So it's something that I think people are interested in following, but ultimately the British housing culture will create its own version, I think. Of course, we've got very distinct planning policies over here as well.
You mention other countries there. I'm just interested in your experience. Can we take any lessons from America or wherever it might be? What are other countries doing right that we're not?
Australia, is the one I've got particular experience of, and they are creating very interesting individual houses that are designed with an individual person in mind, yet they're easing it through all the planning systems, and the fixed cost issue is dealt with. When you build a house in Australia, you're building it effectively out of a package. So it's a bit like buying a new car, really. You've got the basic package, and then you've got the optional extras, all of which is guaranteed in terms of price and scheduled delivery as well. So that model, I think, is particularly interesting. People know what they're getting up front, whereas if you build your house over here, as I've experienced, you can start in April, and by June, the budget's overrun. The design is probably different than it was in April, and the builder has already gone. So you've got sort of issues that I think you need to address there, but it's going to take time to do. I think people are impatient for it, but custom build, I think, will be a larger mass market offering. You've also got to bear in mind that actually most people who buy houses in the UK buy second-hand houses, effectively. They're buying older housing stock, and that's not going to change. There's 23 million houses in the UK. Even by adding 30 or 40,000 custom-built homes a year, the chances are that people are going to be buying a second-hand house rather than a new custom-built house. So it's still quite a small part of the market.
We talked a little bit about some of the pitfalls that we might fall into. Maybe we could dig a bit deeper here.
Yeah, certainly one of the, I think, as I said, one of the key mistakes is scheduling and the kind of the cost situation, which is set up from the start in a bad way. But I think another one is kind of bad specification, or kind of, I guess, slightly naive specification, it's probably fairer to say, in that people do get attracted to the products and the materials that have a bit of hype attached to them. I've heard the sort of phrase eco bling used quite a lot recently, which, I think is fair actually in some instances. And one of the mistakes I see people going down is that their willingness to spend tens of thousands of pounds, and it is tens of thousands of pounds, on eco bling products. And I'm not denigrating these particular systems, but things like heat pumps and solar panels and all the rest of it. And actually, they're never even going to spend £40,000 on heating or energy in their whole lifetime. So that's a simple issue, I think, that people need to address, really. And, one of the things I've really seen work very well is what's known as a sort of fabric first approach, which basically is making sure that you insulate your house really well and make it as airtight, and invest in the solid materials that don't change. Minimising energy use and the heat demand in a house is by far the smartest thing that people will do, particularly if they're off mains. So that's, I guess, get the priorities right in terms of the way you budget and specify your house is a critical issue. The other one is planning, really, and I think ultimately that is such a difficult thing for people to approach from as an amateur from a starting point, that they're often not willing to invest in expertise. They're relying on their architect to guide them through the planning process. And I don't want to come across as anti-architect, by the way, but actually, architects, by and large, know a bit about planning. They don't know loads about it, particularly because planning changes so often. Their primary job is to design a really great house that meets the needs of their clients. And what they're going to be able to do, I don't think, is keep in touch with all those minuscule changes to planning policy, which happen so often that we don't even know about them. So invest in expertise in the planning process, and that obviously usually means a planning consultant. So find a good planning consultant is an absolutely critical way of unlocking the potential of some sites.
It's always funny doing this podcast where I know there are people in other countries who perhaps can't understand this difficulty that we have, but do you think it's going to relax a bit over time, or is that wishful thinking, or do we want it to relax? I don't know. This situation seems very odd when most of the people I speak to have difficulties, far more difficulties than that was fun, or that was easy.
Yeah, well, let's address the planning issue and the plot issue on that basis, because there are unique factors to the UK in terms of a relatively limited land supply. It's a small island ultimately in terms of acreage, but actually our planning policies and the way we've set up planning since 1948, it has changed. It's changed significantly over the years. If you look at the 60s and certainly the 60s and early 70s, there was a huge number of houses built on greenfield sites on the edge of existing small settlements. The town I live in doubled in size in the 1960s, and it's a town of 4,000 homes, 4,000 people. So planning policies do change over time, and I think despite all their best efforts, the planning policies that we've put in since then have created more difficulties for people to build houses than we might expect, really. And even now, in 2013, it's almost impossible to get planning permission to build one individual eco-friendly house on a greenfield site on the edge of a village. When actually I know that wasn't the case even 15 years ago. It was a lot easier then. So we're moving towards more difficulty. And the government has done quite a bit in terms of the National Planning Policy Framework to ease things, but it's going to be a few years before that begins to affect things on the ground. So the UK situation is unique in that we have a lack of land, but also a cultural message that is we want to protect the countryside, and the countryside is something that's not to be lived in, ultimately. It's to be preserved as a museum. And I don't see any other countries having that attitude. And that is the one thing I've really sort of found difficult to accept. We complain constantly about the issues of pubs closing down and schools closing down, post offices closing down, and all this stuff in the countryside. That, the countryside is effectively dying, in my opinion. And yet the one thing we don't want is new houses to help young families live there. It seems completely insane.
Yes, this is the NIMBY situation, effectively, isn't it? Not in my backyard. And I often look at it that I'm sure if these people who live in these areas had more involvement, or if they felt that the communities was developing well, they'd be much more up for it. But it's this scary mentality, and I'll tell you, I've seen it where I live, that you just feel out of control as a town. I've only lived in this town for 8 years, and I can tell you it has changed. It's just changed in how it feels as a place, and that may just be London sprawling out. It's just that sense of control. I think that's what people don't like. Yeah,
people absolutely, and I think people are very, quite rightly, quite precious about the places they live. And I think to an extent everybody's a NIMBY. And I think you have to accept that, really. That it's easy to sort of criticise people who do campaign against development, but actually once you get into that really pretty village, the last thing you want is a field at the back of you built, having 45 homes built on there. So we all have that mentality, and I think that's acceptable and completely part of human nature, really. But also I think we have to accept that if we want our children to live in these villages and towns, then we have to allow house building in certain areas, and better for it to be high quality, I think, and of individual design ideally, than for it to be the kind of housing stock that we've seen go up over the years. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that NIMBYism has become so ingrained, actually, is that people don't necessarily object to quite nicely designed low impact houses near them. I don't think they object to that. What they object to, and their fear, is the state of X named big house builder that the houses look absolutely awful and it's all badly designed and is in the place of their old school. It's that kind of stuff that people really don't like. And once housing design improves, and hopefully once this kind of custom build kind of culture kicks in, I think you might find the NIMBYism begins to gradually fade away. At least we hope that.
Another aspect I want to throw in here, which I still feel just every so often it crops up in my mind, that we just have too many people on the planet. And I think that is going to speed things up. Now, I know this is not probably relevant to our discussion fully, but I do feel that if we encourage growth, we're just going to keep heading down this route. Does this feature at all in house building, or do we just let it go on?
Well, look, I mean, I've sort of, funny enough, I kind of saw some interesting stats. I think it was yesterday where the world population. Actually, I was reading a sort of an atlas to my boy who's 3, and the first page was world population growth, and it was it's something crazy, sort of from 1 billion to 6 billion in about 100 years or something like that, which was terrifying, really, when you think about it, and particularly when you think about the future needs. The fact is that people seem to want to come to the UK, and people seem to want to have children, and I don't think you can necessarily stop either of those. So to an extent, you've got to face the fact that you need to create housing for them. Otherwise, where are they going to live? So you can either begin to go down a cultural shift where you create multi-generational households, which I think is one interesting point. So you're creating homes where actually people don't have to move out when they're 30 or 25 or 20 as it used to be back when I moved out. And granny and granddad live with you as well. So that's one shift that could happen. But ultimately, we've got this figure of 250,000 new homes that are needed each year. Not one government has met it, as far as I can see, since the 1960s. And therefore, it seems to me unlikely that they're ever going to meet that target. So we do need a smart approach. And my sense really is that certain areas of the southeast, and actually parts of the Midlands, to be fair, are pretty much near capacity in terms of what's acceptable in terms of number of houses. There's a huge demand in those areas, I admit. But there are huge areas as well as the UK that need to be utilised better. If you go up into the north, into the southwest, into parts of Wales and into Scotland in particular, there are huge areas where housing densities are the same as they would be in America or Australia. Yet the whole of the UK seems to be based around a small patch of the southeast, which, in itself is a bit weird if you think about it. I know it's the way the economy is developed, but my sense is that there are things that can be done there just to spread the load a bit more around the UK.
Well, let's finish up here with just a couple of things. First of all, going back to home building and renovating, what is it that you give someone who wants to consume your content, to read your magazine, to check online, whatever it may be, watch your videos?
Well, look, and I think, we've all done it, which I think really helps. We've all been through the process, which I think is the number one thing really for us. But it's helped us to kind of realise that actually as somebody who's building or renovating an individual home, the whole world of self-build and renovation is quite daunting for the new person, for somebody who's not done it before. There are lots of choices to be made about things that you don't know whether are bad or good. There are lots of people trying to take money off you to buy their products or services. And what we try to give is independent advice and a bit of a guide through that jungle. And I think it's important to have that because there aren't many independent voices around in the sector. There are experts who work for heating companies or brick companies or architects or whatever, who always, I think, they've always got something interesting to say, and I absolutely value their discussion. But generally they come at it from a particular angle, and what we're trying to do is come at it from an angle representing the person who's trying to make that choice. And I think that's absolutely fundamentally what we need to do and do more of, and I think we do well at the moment. And also, to an extent, we're an advocate for it. There are obviously, TV shows like Grand Designs really encourage people to get on and do this. But I think what we try and do is give a realistic, non-hyped assessment of what it's like to build an individual home or renovate significantly. My main criticism of Grand Designs is a program I love, but my main criticism is that it actually creates drama where there need not be drama. A fair few projects go over budget and over schedule, but actually if you look at the grand scheme of the thousands of self-builds that happen each year, most of them are done very well and drama-free. My own project was a good case in point. If you can get experts involved and listen to people, then generally it's a lot easier than you might think. And I think that's one of the messages that we need to get out more as an industry, actually, is that it's not quite the daunting drama that you might expect by watching the TV shows. Actually, it's a massively rewarding experience, life-changing, really, it certainly was for us, and something that needn't be as difficult as you might think.
Is there any final point or something that we haven't talked about that you think is worth concluding the interview on?
Well, sure. I think it's a changing kind of world for self-builders, and I think in terms of the way that they're finding plots and the way they're getting planning permission is really going to change in the coming years ahead. And I think it's a very exciting time actually for self-build in the wider sense, because there's been so much effort put into making things easier and getting those millions of people I talked about earlier who can't find a plot because when they go on Rightmove, plots don't come up. If that can significantly change, then I think we'll see the wider self-build world change massively over the next 5 years, and that can only be a good thing.
Jason, thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot. Nice to see you.
Really good to hear Jason very passionate about self-build and custom build, as you would hope from the editor of Homebuilding and Renovating. With each episode, we have show notes here, and these aim to be the point of reference, reinforcing any of the learnings from the session. You'll find them today at houseplanninghelp.com/37. It's also the place to engage with us. Perhaps you want to comment on something that Jason has said. Well, that's exactly the place to do it. And I throw in the odd question as well. For this episode, what's been the biggest challenge of your project so far, and how have you overcome it? So it'd be interesting to hear what you've got to say there. Self-builders are very good at sharing information, so I'd like to know what's happened with you so far. I also have a call to action to finish up on, and that is if you use Twitter, perhaps you could send out a tweet about this podcast. Maybe it's to your favourite episode or just to the website in general, but it would really be appreciated. Or via the wonders of the internet, why not go to a pre-populated tweet where it'll do it all for you, houseplanninghelp.com/share, and that will save you some time. The letters SHARE, houseplanninghelp.com/share. Next time, lovely Bronwyn Barry from One Sky Homes. She is my guest, and we're going to be talking about windows. So until then, take care.